So first, let me talk about what exactly is economics, clear up any misconceptions you might have. What economics is it's the study of how people make choices and what are the effects of those choices, right? So it's not, some people you meet and you say, oh yeah, I'm an economist, and they think you know all about the stock market, or all you do is talk about money. And that's something you can do with economics, right? Because you make choices when you're dealing with money. You make choices when you're thinking about buying stocks and things like that and other types of investments. But what we're really interested in is all kinds of choices, whether they deal with money or not, right? And the thing about economics is that we realize that every single choice we make involves trade-offs. And the reason there are trade-offs is because there's always some other thing you can do with when you have a choice, right? You can make one decision, you can go with another route, right? There's always something you can do with either spending your time or your money. For example, you guys made an economic choice to show up to class today, right? There's always something else you guys could have done, right? You guys could have stayed home, watched a movie, stayed in bed, gone to the movies, right? Something else you could have done, but you came to class instead, so you guys made an economic choice, right? And notice that really didn't have to do much with money. I mean, maybe you guys could have worked, right? You could have earned money there. Yeah, you could have stayed at work longer, right? So, yeah, sometimes it deals with money, but not necessarily all the time, right? Okay, so that's what economics is. It's all about choices and trying to understand not only how people make choices and why they make the choices they make, but also what are the effects of those choices. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about why I chose to study economics. I started off as a business student, right? I was actually in finance, so I was, thinking about how to make money to get rich, right? And then I took my first economics class, and I immediately switched to it because I really liked being able to think about what's best for all of society. It just kind of fit with my own kind of the way my mind works. Is I like thinking, big picture, what's best for society. So, I'm kind of into politics and things like that. And so economics allows you to do that, whereas most of the other fields that are in the business school, like marketing, finance, accounting, they're all about, thinking about what's best for a particular business most of the time, right? I mean, sometimes accounting professors are thinking about what kind of rules and regulations should be in place, right? And that's kind of a thinking about society, but it's again, thinking about it in a narrow way. Economics allows you to think about the big picture in lots of different ways, right? And that's really why I switched to it, and I'm very glad that I did, because I'm very happy doing what I do. Okay, so enough about me. Let's dive into a little bit about the subfields of economics, right? So the broadest way to categorize economics is between two big giant subfields. Microeconomics and macroeconomics, right? So microeconomics, what it involves is studying individual people and businesses, right? So you're just focusing on basically one thing at a time, like one person or maybe one market, like one type of a good or service that's being bought or sold, right? Or one firm, and thinking about how they behave and how should they behave, right? Whereas macroeconomics deals with the impact of economic choices on an entire community or a state or a country, or even you could even think about the whole world, right? So macroeconomics is really more big picture, whereas micro is focusing in just like a microscope, right? Focusing in on individuals, right? Okay, so some topics from microeconomics, just to give you guys some examples of what microeconomics is. One question you might think of that would be a microeconomic question would be, how many people should a firm hire, right? So that's a single firm, and given its business, the technology it uses in its business and what kind of business it has, what would be the best level of employment that this firm should try to get, right? How many people should it hire, right? So that's a microeconomic question. Another is, how is the price of internet service determined, right? And I like to talk about this because I like to complain about the fact that where I live in Peachtree City, there's only one internet service provider, Comcast, right? And so they have a monopoly in my city. This means I don't have any choice. They don't have any competitors. If I wanted to switch, I'd have to move somewhere where there's more than one competitor or somebody else, right? So that means, I feel like I pay very high prices for my internet, but, it's kind of a necessity for me. I mean, I wouldn't be able to function quite as well if I didn't have internet in my home. And so that factors into the prices that I kind of need internet. There's only one provider, no competition, and so the price seems to be kind of high, right? Another question, a very microeconomic question, similar to the choice that you made in coming to class today is, well, should a high school graduate, should they start a career or go directly to college, right? And that's a choice that, most of us face, right? We face that choice of, should I get started making money now, or should I invest in what we call my human capital and gain more skills and knowledge and then go get that degree, be able to signal that I can do things, right? And so that's a microeconomic question as well, because it's going to be different for different people, right? Depending on their skills, depending on what they want to do, right? Another top topic from microeconomics that you guys may be familiar with, because it's kind of a recent thing that's been in the headlines, at least in the last 6 months or so, or maybe even year, I don't know, is this guy Martin Shkreli. You guys may recognize him. So the question is, so what he did was he, with his company, they bought the rights to a drug. They spent $55 million buying the rights to this drug, right? And it's a 62-year-old drug that's been around for a very long time. And they raised the price from the drug from $13.50 per pill, kind of expensive. You think of just one little pill costing $13.50. But they raised that price from $13.50 to $750 per pill, right? So over 5,000%. I think it's like 5,556% or something like that. So the price per pill, right? So $750 per pill. And of course, you guys may have seen this. The whole entire internet exploded. Everybody was very upset about this, right? Because it seemed like price gouging. But the question is, well, I mean, that's a lot of money to pay per pill, right? I mean, would anybody pay that much per pill? Well, this drug that he was selling at this price, I mean, it's a very important drug for some people. It helps people who have this disease called toxoplasmosis, and basically without this pill, they wouldn't be able to function. And so it's very much a necessity for them, just like the internet is kind of probably a little bit less of a necessity for people like me, right? And I'm sure many of you as well. And so he kind of knew that he could raise the price on this pill because people need it so much. And that meant that if the price was that, then they'd have to pay it. Maybe some people couldn't. Too bad for them. That's this guy's mindset, right? And so you might say, well, would anybody be willing to pay that much? Could they pay that much? Well, they did. You can see his revenue for this drug, Daraprim. This was before the drug was sold to his company, right? You can see revenue was a good amount. It's $667,000 or so. But then after he raised the price over 5,000%, you see that revenue actually rose, right? So revenue rose even though he raised the price. So he was able to make more money. And what that tells us, the kind of the fancy way to talk about that, is that since revenue increased, that tells us that this drug, Daraprim, has inelastic demand, right? And that kind of makes sense because, again, these people who need this drug, they don't have any other options, right? There's no other competing thing that they could get, and they need it so bad. So if the price rises, their demand isn't going to change very much. So it's inelastic demand, and that's why the revenue rose. And so this guy knew what he was doing when he raised the price. I guess he just underestimated what the reaction would be as far as the rest of society kind of being upset about that, right? Okay, so that's a microeconomic topic, right? It's one firm thinking about what kind of price should they charge, and it's kind of interesting to see how thinking about bringing in as much revenue and maximizing your profit isn't necessarily the only thing you have to consider. I mean, this guy, a lesson he probably learned is that you might want to consider also how society's going to react to it, right? Okay, another topic from microeconomics is game theory, right? And game theory, what it is it deals with decisions that we make where what we want to choose, what we think is going to be the right decision depends on what other people are going to do, right? A lot of decisions we make are kind of in a vacuum. Like we just decide, what should we do? You know, should I buy a hamburger? Should I buy a hot dog? It's not like I'm going to enjoy my hot dog more because you're having pizza, or if you switch to something else, I'm going to want to switch to a hamburger, right? I mean, so most of our decisions, a lot of the decisions we make are in a vacuum, but game theory studies when decisions are not made in a vacuum, where what somebody else does affects your outcome and depending on what you choose, right? So there's lots of examples from sports for game theory, unsurprisingly given what it's called, game theory, right? Since sports are games. But the example I like to bring up is a football team, right? So if you're familiar with football, you can, when you're on offense, you know, for a play, you can run the ball or you can throw the ball, right? So if you just think of those two options and you're deciding, oh, should we run this play or should we pass this play? Well, what is going to be your best option is going to depend on what you think the other team is going to do. Are they going to defend the run? Are they going to have a bunch of linemen up close to the line, defensive linemen? Or are they going to back off a little bit and defend the pass? Well, what you think they're going to do is going to affect your decision, right? And so that's game theory, where your choice and what you think is going to be best depends on what the other person is going to do, right? Lots of other examples from sports. For example, tennis, right? So you can serve the ball left or you can serve the ball right. Now, if you serve the ball left every single time, then somebody else is going to start cheating over to the left a little bit, right? Well, they're right? So, you know, so you want to switch it up a little bit, and that's something that game theory tells us, right? So that's also a microeconomic topic, right? Game theory. Now let's switch to talking about macroeconomics, right? So macroeconomics, thinking about the big picture, how choices that people make affect all of the economy, basically, right? So one topic would be, what would be the effect of a tax cut on the unemployment rate, right? If there's a tax cut, then that means you know, people are going to bring in more income. They're not going to have to pay as much taxes. Their disposable income, their after-tax income would be higher, right? And if people are spending more money, if they have more money to spend, then that's going to help the economy grow a little bit. And so hopefully there'd be less unemployment, right? So a topic of macroeconomics is figuring out how a tax cut might affect the unemployment rate. If you cut the taxes by this much, then how much is the unemployment rate going to be affected, and so on and so forth, right? Another question is, what are the causes and consequences of inflation, right? Inflation is when prices are rising, overall prices in the economy, right? So prices rising. What causes prices to rise over time? Why was there such high inflation in the 1970s when we had 10, 15, 20% inflation at some points? Why do some countries experience what we call hyperinflation, where prices could be doubling, say, every day or every week? What causes that, right? So again, that's a macroeconomic concept, because we're thinking about prices in the overall economy, not just the price of one drug, like what Martin Shkreli was selling, right? Another macroeconomic topic is why do we have a financial crisis, right? We just had a financial crisis in this country a few years ago, right? And the economy is still kind of reeling from it. What were the causes for that? And also, what are the effects of it, of course, and how do we get out of it? A very big topic in macroeconomics is macroeconomic growth. And you can see here on this graph that economic growth is a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, this could go back even further. It goes to the year 0. And what we're measuring here on the vertical axis is GDP per capita, right? So that's the value of output per person, right? And it's also equal to people's income on average, right? Average income. So you can see the average income, you might notice here there's a little tiny step down right here. I think a big part of that was because the Roman Empire fell, right? Empires back in the day of empires, they were rising and falling all over the world, but the Romans kind of they had a little bit of a higher kind of standard of living than other civilizations. So when they fell, that was a step down, but it's barely even noticeable, almost negligible, right? At least compared to the scale that we're on now. And you see that over more than 1,000 years, and going back even further, the standard of living didn't change very much, right? So how you lived was going to be very similar to how your offspring or even your ancestors lived, right? So one generation to the next, not much changed, right? It's very different than what we experience today, where one generation to the next in our society for where we are now, it's very different. I mean, just look at what we have. I mean, we have smartphones, we have all kinds of things, computers, laptops, hoverboards, right? I mean, all kinds of things that 30, 40 years ago did not exist, right? And why did that happen? Well, you can see that it started going up a little bit after the year 1000 AD, right? And then it really started to take off right here. And what happened right here was the Industrial Revolution, right? So we started getting better, being able to harness new forms of energy that we didn't really use before for certain purposes. Like coal was used to heat a house, but then eventually, steam engines that ran on coal started being developed, and then electricity was invented, and that really helped us to have a lot higher of a standard of living, right? And so you can see that this very drastic change here happened, and the main culprit, what really got it going, was technological development, right? And that's what we've determined from thinking about growth. Another way to think about growth is to compare different countries, not just the entire world over time, but look at different countries. And you might say, look at this satellite image from the Korean Peninsula and see, okay, well, what's going on here? We have North Korea, and it's very dark, right? There's not very much going on here. So this is, what economic growth looks like at night. And we see there's just a little tiny bit of light in Pyongyang. That's the capital of North Korea, right? So, pretty big city, but it's a little tiny bit of light. And you can see this border town up here bordering China. There's a little bit of light there. Compare that to South Korea, and you see South Korea is all lit up. Seoul, and all its surroundings are very well lit up, and there's lots of other big towns throughout South Korea, right? And so this is what basically economic growth looks like at night. When you see this, okay, South Korea, they have plenty of electricity, right? They can turn their lights on. Not so much in most of North Korea, right? And so that's an indication that economic growth has been going on in South Korea, but not in North Korea. And then the next question you might ask is, well, why the big difference? Why? I mean, is it the case that South Korea has a bunch of diamond mines or gold mines, and that's why everybody's rich there, and those kinds of things aren't up here? Well, no. I mean, if you look at the physical resources, this is a fairly small-sized peninsula. It's basically the same. It's basically the same physical resources from one side of the border to the next, right? And what's different is just how the country is run, right? You have a dictator up here who is basically just treating his citizens as trash, basically. I mean, not treating them very well, almost like slaves, if you will. Whereas in South Korea, I mean, they're kind of similar to here, right? Where there's a lot more freedom. You can have a lot more opportunities to start your own business, things like that, right? And so that's mainly the difference between the North and the South there. It's just that the countries run different, right? They have different institutions, we would say. Okay. Another topic from macroeconomics that I love to point out to my students is what's going on right now these days with excess reserves. So the question here is, why are banks sitting on all this cash? So let me define what this is. So you notice here that the title for this graph here is excess reserves of depository institutions, right? Depository institutions, they just mean banks. I don't know why they just don't write banks, but I guess they want to be inclusive of things other than banks that also take deposits, right? And what this is excess reserves, right? So banks have to hold on to a certain amount of reserves, right? So people put in their deposits. Banks make their money by lending money out, right? That's the traditional way that banks run their business, right? They take in deposits, lend money out, earn interest from people who are borrowing. That's the basic model of a banking business. And so banks usually lend out as much money as they can. They don't have any excess reserves. They lend it all out, right? And you can see, like, that's why you can't really see this graph almost the entire time going back several decades to 1985. Excess reserves are very low the whole entire time. You see a little blip here between 2000 and 2005. What do you guys think that was? What do you think caused that little blip? I know one person knows.
9/11?
Yeah, it was 9/11, right? And so what was going on with 9/11 is, and why there's a little blip right there of excess reserves going up and then coming down, was that for a few weeks or a few months there after 9/11 happened, people were a little bit uncertain about the economy, right? People were saying, okay, well, are there going to be more terrorist attacks? Is the government going to go into martial law? Is that going to hurt my business? Is that going to... And so if you're a banker, you're going to be more likely to want to hold on to your reserves. And maybe if someone applies for a loan at your bank, be a little bit hesitant, right? And even if you're running a business or thinking about running a business, you might be a little bit unwilling to take out a loan, right? So less likely for people to want to take out a loan, less likely for banks to want to lend. And so there's going to be a little bit of excess reserves where banks are holding on to more money than they have to. But again, that's just a little tiny blip compared to what's been going on in recent years. You see, since the financial crisis hit in 2008 or so, right, 2007, 2008, excess reserves have gone up quite a bit, right? And again, that's an indication that there's fear, there's uncertainty. Banks are unwilling to lend, people are unwilling to take out loans for the same reasons as why we saw this blip, right? People are uncertain about the economy. We just had a financial crisis. We're not quite back out of it. We're not quite, we still have, we're not back to potential output. We're not doing as well as we could. Banks are less willing to lend. People are less willing to take out loans. And so you see excess reserves are very high. Now, how high are the excess reserves? You may look at this graph and say, okay, well, it's in millions. But yes, it's in millions, but we're talking about millions of millions, right? So that means that we're talking about trillions of dollars. This is roughly $2.5 trillion worth of excess reserves. Now, it's kind of hard to put that number into perspective. So what I like to do when I tell my students about this is put it on a per person in the entire United States basis, right? And per person, this amount of excess reserves is roughly equal to about $6,000 per person that banks are sitting on that they could lend out, but they're not, right? So that's quite a bit of money, $6,000 for every single man, woman, and child in the entire economy that banks could lend out, but they're not, right? They're free to lend out these reserves, but they're choosing not to. That's an indication of how scared they are, right? It's also an indication of how much money the Federal Reserve has been trying to pump into the economy, but banks are still hesitant to lend it, right? That's another reason why it's been going up. But the fact that they're positive in the first place, that tells you that there's something weird going on, right? Because banks are scared to do what they normally do to try to make money, right? Okay, so I hope that you guys have seen that economics is a very broad topic. You can use it to analyze lots of different things, and by studying it, depending on how much you study it, you learn a lot of valuable skills, right? And you can use those skills to analyze all kinds of different topics, right? There are many different types of economists. There's economic historians, people who look at what's happened in history and try to determine, why did this happen? Econometricians, people who use statistics to try and figure out the relationships between certain variables. Forecasters, trying to figure out what's something going to look like in the future. What's the unemployment rate going to be in the future? What's the inflation rate going to be in the future? What's that stock going to be worth in the future, right? Policy analysts, figuring out what kind of an effect are certain government policies and institutions going to have on the economy. Health economists, trying to figure out what are the effects of different type of health policies and things like that, and also demographic changes going on. Environmental economists, people thinking about how the economy interacts with the environment and vice versa. I was just talking with a colleague in the hall about how there's sports economists, right? People who study certain types of sports and various aspects of that. Like, for example, someone who I went to graduate school with, they actually published a paper recently, and what this person looked at was what is the effects of if there's a fight in an NHL hockey game, what is the purpose of that? What is the effect of that? And he found that actually when there's a fight, the hits over the next few minutes or so, the hockey players hitting each other, it actually goes down, right? So when there's a fight, then there tends to be a little bit less hitting afterwards, which is kind of interesting. I don't know. So apparently that's kind of like the part of the purpose for hockey players getting in fights. So there's all kinds of ways to be an economist, right? Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg.